It's my great pleasure to welcome back one of our very distinguished graduates, Susan Lamb. Susan is an international criminal and humanitarian law practitioner with about 17, I think it's more than 17, isn't it? It's more than 17 years of experience with various United Nations international criminal tribunals. She spent most of her life going into war zones, including the International Criminal Tribunal for Yugoslavia, it was awful times, the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda, and the Extraordinary Chamber in the Courts of Cambodia, which she's how many years did you spend in that? Quite a few years. 5 years in Cambodia. And for the past 2 years, Susan has worked on accountability efforts in relation to atrocity crimes committed in the course of the very sad Syrian crisis. And before commencing her United Nations career, Susan undertook doctoral studies in public international law at Balliol College, Oxford, as a Rhodes Scholar, one of our Rhodes Scholars, and we're very proud of it. Susan's a graduate of this university in both law and politics, and she won the first family law moot, I remember, years ago in Auckland. I remember you doing that. I'm very proud of you doing that, Susan, but you went on to do international law. There's nothing wrong with that. And we're very fortunate to have Susan here with us tonight. And Susan's talking on a topic which couldn't be more timely, and we actually have the immigration lawyer in Dunedin here who's looking after many of the Syrian people who've come. Mohammed over here is looking after them. So to speak to us tonight, what are the prospects for and barriers to accountability for serious international crimes committed during the Syrian conflict? So please give Susan a great big welcome.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mark, for that very generous introduction, and thank you to you all for coming out at the end of a day to hear this presentation. I think, as the title suggests, this is not a presentation for optimists. This is what my modest aim over the course of this lecture is to show in outline what the barriers are to accountability for the crimes that have self-evidently been committed in Syria, and also what, if any, prospects there are for accountability. I should note at the outset that I'm not a Syrian expert or even a Middle Eastern political expert, but I think what I can do over the course of today is give you a snapshot as to how complicated the conflict in Syria is. There are features of it that make it more complicated than many other similar conflicts in which justice responses have been tried. But the second dimension of this is that it's not merely the Syrian conflict that is complicated. The timing coincides with a deeper crisis of confidence within the international criminal justice mechanisms as well. And the two interact in very, very tragic ways. I'm going to just paint a very brief background to the Syrian crisis, if really only to set a little bit of context. I'm deliberately simplifying it because the details within each of these limbs are complicated, and political scientists and historians are probably still attempting to make sense of various elements of it. But in outline, it's true to say that the Syrian crisis has entered its 6th year, and it continues very sadly unabated. It's also beyond doubt that very serious international crimes have been committed in the course of this conflict. I'm not going to define in any great detail what grave international crimes are, but colloquially, and what we're all familiar with from the media, is these are crimes such as crimes against humanity, war crimes, and potentially, in relation to a couple of scenarios, genocide. I'm going to deliberately not speak for the entire hour so that there are time for questions. Any aspect of this presentation can be picked up in there, and that crimes have been committed by numerous parties to the Syrian conflict. No one belligerent party has a monopoly on those crimes. It's also incontrovertible that the Syrian crisis is the direct cause of hundreds of thousands of deaths, and it has also prompted a significant refugee crisis throughout Europe, and which has in turn had a domino effect on the political discourse in Europe as well. The crisis commenced in outline in February 2011. Its origins are complex, but the immediate precipitating cause was a series of localized demonstrations throughout Syria that to some extent are part and parcel of the broader Arab Spring movement. Initially, they commenced as calls for greater levels of political participation. That was responded to by the Assad regime with measures that had been tried and practiced for the last 4 decades. There was nothing qualitatively different about the Assad's regime's initial response to protests. They had always been suppressed rather brutally. What differed this time, however, is that those measures ceased to work and they escalated. It is a conflict that has ebbed and flowed in various different phases, and the tactical realities to the Syrian conflict shift on an almost daily basis. But it's true to say that the conflict, broadly speaking, one can identify at least 2 phases. There's the initial crackdown against the emergent political opposition, and that in time led to the emergence of an increasingly organized armed opposition. Then in later phases, that both sides of that conflict fragmented, with on the regime side being supported by a number of Shiite-based irregular troops. Some of you may have heard the use of the term Shabiha, for example. These are irregular forces that are thought to be largely Shiite-backed, and they've got various origins, but they, broadly speaking, support the regime side of the conflict. And then, of course, one had fragmentation of the various opposition groups, including extremist Islamist opposition groups, of which the most notorious, but certainly by no means the only, is the Islamic State. The pattern of criminality does bear some relationship to that subdivision I've made. The general pattern of crimes orchestrated by the Syrian regime have frequently been detention-related crimes. The Assad regime is thought conservatively to have incarcerated tens of thousands of members of the opposition or suspected opposition, and those individuals have been subject to torture and are incarcerated within an extensive nationwide network, and it is thought that the torture and incarceration of political opponents and the very wide dragnet cast by the regime has itself been a contributing cause to the emergence of the more virulent opposition forces. On the other side, the various Islamist groups, the Islamic State needs no introduction, that more openly perpetrates crimes against civilians, but it is an open question as to which belligerent has committed the most. But they are certainly by any measure grave international crimes, even if they differ in character and superficial manifestation. This is just one graphic. I'm going to show another later. It's limited to the situation between August 2014 and February 2016. My purpose in showing it is to show that the situation in Iraq and Syria has a complex and dynamic interrelationship, with the Islamic State actually having its origins in Iraq. But this is a good example of how the broader destabilization in Syria was utilized by the Islamic State to spread into Syria, and the Islamic State straddles both countries, and one of its objectives is to create a caliphate that at this stage has its heartland in Syria and Iraq, but at least an aspiration, if at least the Islamic State's propaganda is to be believed, is global in its aspirations. Now, why is the Syrian crisis itself so intractable? If one looks at similar cases historically of armed conflicts, there are several forces that generally bring armed conflicts to an end. Either the belligerents are defeated militarily, or they run out of weaponry or other means to continue their fight, or they lose popular support. Well, there are features of the Syrian conflict which immeasurably complicate that situation and mean that they are they defy historical parallels and have certain features that make the conflict more violent, harder to stop, and basically give rise to a kind of self-reinforcing set of circumstances that cause the conflict to continue. The first is that it's multi-party. That always makes a peace settlement more complicated. But not only is the conflict multi-party, it is backed by multiple foreign states, all of whom have diametrically opposed interests. And thirdly, there is a concern on the part of many of the belligerents as to the post-conflict environment that would inhere within the Syrian region, which means that virtually no side is confident about the post-conflict outcome, which gives, in many perverse respects, an incentive to continue the fight. So there is fragmentation on the ground. This very, very simplistic dualistic sort of Syrian regime versus domestic opposition is utterly is inaccurate insofar as that there is so much fragmentation within various Syrian units on the ground that even if by some miracle every foreign intervener could disappear, there is no singular emergent consensus, and so much devastation of state institutions and civil society that that would be an extraordinary ask anyway. The conflict has raged for so long that there is a sense of a zero-sum game, that there is a sense on most sides of the absolute imperative need to emerge victorious, but with no belligerent really having the capacity to achieve that result militarily. And then thirdly, there is foreign intervention by forces that pit themselves against each other in an intractable way. And in particular, the division between Shiite and Sunni forces confronts it's very directly in the Syrian context, with basically Iran supporting the Assad regime and Saudi Arabia and others supporting the more moderate Islamist opposition. But another added layer to this is that all other states that have intervened to a greater or lesser extent in the conflict are also not united in their vision, which means that there is no obvious fulcrum with which the international community can intervene and force a peaceful settlement. I'm going to give just a couple of examples to that. The general position of the Turkish government, for example, has been an anti-Assad one. However, the main force in the region that could be a bulwark both against ISIS and Assad are the Kurdish forces, which is, of course, revisits the Kurdish nightmare from the Turkish perspective. Iran basically is upholds the Syrian regime as a sort of bulwark against the threat of Sunni domination in the region. That's the opposite for the Sunni backers. And with regard to other Western states, the prospect, there is no clear consensus other than that that Russia has decisively intervened in the conflict on the side of Assad, apparently out of a belief that by containing the conflict within Syria, it prevents the spread of a contagion of Islamic extremism into Europe, which it has its own historical reason. It sees that through its own historic lens as well. The United States and the United Kingdom have the policy of those states has generally alternated between a demand that Assad is not a viable part of the picture versus an appreciation that there is no viable alternative to Assad among the collective forces that remain, at least as of now. There is some argument to say that an earlier opportunity was lost, and that earlier intervention on the side of the more moderate Assad opposition might have shifted the conflict decisively, but there was no clear unity among those forces there as well, or certainly not of the sort that persuaded decisive American intervention into the Syrian conflict. Bear in mind that the American president was the newly incumbent Barack Obama, who came in with the legacy of wishing to extricate American forces from Iraq, and with no happy memory or no happy experience of American engagement in Iraq. And so that was the lens through which the United States viewed this. This is again a very simplified picture of just some of the belligerent parties supported by various groups. Suffice it to note that many of those many of those colours ensure that show bodies that or areas that are either backed or controlled by groupings that are inextricably opposed to each other. So effectively, there is no unified singular vision of either a post-conflict Syria or even a sort of acceptable endgame to the Syrian crisis. And within that impasse, the Russians have intervened, hoping to ensure a decisive military victory for Assad, but with that victory being utterly dependent on the decisive intervention of Iran and Russia, and in turn giving rise to extreme fears on the part of the other belligerents and an utter lack of confidence in any post-conflict outcome. So what, in the midst of this, my professional focus has been how to actually achieve accountability for the numerous atrocity crimes that have been committed in Syria against numerous civilian groups by virtually all belligerents. Well, what are the usual justice responses to atrocity crimes? Well, usually there would be one of three possible models. The first would be, let me reverse the order of that actually. The first would be referral to the permanent standing International Criminal Tribunal, the International Criminal Court, or the ICC, which come into force in 2002, and whose jurisdiction is prospective, that is, it looks forward from 2002. So theoretically, at least, the International Criminal Court should have been one possible forum to try offenders committing grave international crimes in Syria. For reasons which I'll outline, the International Criminal Court is largely hamstrung from doing so. That is not an unprecedented situation. And reflecting that, there have been various ad hoc international criminal tribunals created principally by the United Nations Security Council to respond to atrocity crimes in situations either where the ICC is unable to act, or principally because it was not yet in existence, or where the situation is grave enough that it's thought to warrant it. Examples of that is the International Criminal Tribunals for Yugoslavia and Rwanda. Unfortunately, the United Nations Security Council, for the very same reasons that various permanent members of the Security Council in particular are paralyzed, this also forestalls the emergence of any Security Council-backed justice initiative. And in any case, even if we did have the possibility of creating an ad hoc tribunal for Syria, questions would arise as to how financially viable it is. Most of these tribunals are expensive. And secondly, there's been a recent shift towards hybrid or so-called mixed tribunals. The idea that having the UN Security Council operate as the world's sort of justice system is unsustainable in the long term, and without key local engagement from Syrian and/or Iraqi actors, this is very unlikely to take root. Unfortunately, neither ad hoc nor hybrid mechanisms of justice are possible due to a lack of consensus on the Security Council, generalized tribunal fatigue, and a concern, ironically, not to undermine the International Criminal Court, which is thought to be the standing international criminal body and is meant to end this culture of ad hocism. What about a hybrid tribunal? Well, firstly, one can't talk about local justice in any meaningful sense, at least if located in the region, in the situation of an ongoing high-intensity armed conflict. The security environment is inappropriate, and most information we're getting out from Syria, and certainly Iraq, indicates that local justice mechanisms have either completely collapsed or have actually been subverted into the business of committing crimes themselves. The Assad crimes are committed by de jure state forces in Syria. So almost no victim of atrocity crimes in Syria would trust that those same forces would be impartial and trustworthy elements of justice. There is, however, some movement towards hybridized justice in Iraqi Kurdistan. That's one sort of relative bastion of stability within Iraq, where the justice system, comparatively speaking, is still functional. It also has good de facto access to Yazidi victims, and it might be a good opportunity there. But none of us that have worked in Iraq have any great hope in the general sort of robustness of the Iraqi justice system, even if one might accept that Kurdistan is perhaps the most stable and the most realistic of all possibilities. And so the dilemma there is that even if the international community gets behind a form of regionalized justice in Kurdistan, it might have to satisfy itself with judicial outcomes that may be less than optimal. And this was a concern in relation to other hybrid tribunals as well, for example, most particularly in Cambodia. And so there is a general climate of skepticism towards hybrid justice in the light of somewhat mixed experiences in these other tribunals. Why can't the ICC intervene? Well, just very briefly, the International Criminal Court regime is basically an opt-in regime, whereas the other tribunals I've spoken of can be imposed by the UN Security Council, at least where the UN Security Council itself can agree. The International Criminal Court works on a different basis. In order for an International Criminal Court to have jurisdiction or competence to act in any situation, the territorial state actually has to be a party to that statute. And neither Iraq nor Syria are parties at this point to the ICC statute, although there is some advocacy in relation to Iraq to encourage them to go in that direction. So therefore, the International Criminal Court does not have any territorial jurisdiction over Syria and Iraq. That's not the only basis on which the International Criminal Court could operate. In the event that the UN Security Council could agree, it could actually, on a coercive basis, refer the Syrian situation to the International Criminal Court. But just as the permanent members, namely the United States and Russia and the United Kingdom, France and China, cannot agree on the best response, both to the security situation in Iraq or the justice outcome, then Security Council referral has also been completely stymied. This has created an extremely interesting discourse before the United Nations Security Council, which under the United Nations Charter is entrusted as being the global body to uphold and enforce where necessary international peace and security. A number of permanent members of the UN Security Council take that very seriously. They have the precedent in mind from Rwanda, where the Security Council was largely a bystander while the genocide unfolded. And there's extraordinary debates nowadays before the UN Security Council that says, look, if we can't even agree on the most minimal basis to support justice responses in response to what we think is fairly certainly an ongoing genocide, then we've abdicated our responsibility as the principal organ of international peace and security. If we cannot agree on bare minimums, such as, well, look, okay, granted, we're divided. We don't know how best to intervene in Syria. We've had terrible examples of past interventions in Iraq and Libya that haven't brought a dividend. Let us agree at a minimum to support justice initiatives. We can all agree that the killing of innocent civilians is something that we all abhor. So could we not at least agree on that? But even that is not something that the Security Council has managed to rally around. And this has prompted the permanent representative of the United States to basically say, we are in danger of basically voting for our own obsolescence. But that is the crisis of the international community laid bare in relation to the Syrian conflagration. There is a final basis on which the International Criminal Court could intervene, and this one is actually not blocked. Technically, the International Criminal Court could exercise jurisdiction in relation to perpetrators of international crimes who are nationals of state parties. And with the Islamic State in particular, there is some evidence that returning IS fighters did commit grave international crimes in Syria, and in theory could be the subject of ICC intervention. However, the International Criminal Court prosecutor has indicated that she considers this particular jurisdictional basis to be too narrow. The reason for that in outline is that the International Criminal Court, because it surveys a very broad number of situations globally, and because it has constraints both budgetary and staffing-wise, is extremely selective in terms of which cases it takes on. It's forced to be. And so in general, it says we are interested in prosecuting the senior leadership, those most responsible for grave international crimes. Returning Islamic State fighters are generally foot soldiers who, to put it mildly, are not in leadership positions. And that the ICC's considered view, and this is shared by many, is that the Islamic State is a military and political organization primarily led by nationals of Iraq and Syria. And so the concern of the prosecutor, I think, is to avoid the International Criminal Court being mired in this, frankly, sideshow in relation to the most minor perpetrators, whilst it's fiddling while Rome burns, basically. And she's refused to, I think, justifiably refused to allow her, the court to be utilized in that direction. So what other responses has emerged from this stalemate? Well, the first is national prosecutions. Certainly returning Islamic State fighters have been prosecuted domestically, usually for terrorism-related crimes in relation to support for organizations that are illegal. But many countries have also implemented core crimes, such as genocide, crimes against humanity, and war crimes. So the prospect is always present for returning citizens of countries embroiled in those offences to be tried domestically, and there are a handful of those prosecutions, particularly in Germany, to a lesser extent in the UK. There's also some prospect for states to exercise universal jurisdiction over those crimes, so that if notorious perpetrators from the Syrian regime or from any other belligerent happen to transit through countries willing and able to exercise universal jurisdiction over these crimes, this could also occur. The most dramatic example of that in recent history was the arrest in London of General Pinochet. But since then, due to the political sort of blowback from that, most states have actually reduced the extent to which they are willing to rely on universal jurisdiction in criminal matters. The United States has a particularly interesting feature of its national law called the so-called Alien Tort Statute, which often enables perpetrators of grave international crimes with the relevant connection to the United States to be sued for tort in relation to grave international crimes, and that gives rise to the prospect of reparation to victims as well. There are lawyers in the United States actively considering those options as well. The other thing that's happened is that in response to the so-called impunity gap that I've just indicated, and the inability of public institutions on the international plane to respond adequately to the Syrian crisis, a number of civil society organizations have sort of stepped up to try to fill this gap. And one that I will mention is the one I've worked for the last 2 years, and the one I helped found 4 years ago, and it's called the Commission of International Justice and Accountability. It's basically a non-governmental organization. Due to imperatives of security, it never publicizes its location, but it's located in a European capital. And the thinking behind that was that collectively there is enough expertise out there from the ad hoc tribunals and otherwise. We know how to investigate atrocity crimes. We know that often rapid intervention in these situations can often be useful to preserve evidence. And we also know that we need ultimately to transfer those skills away from a select group of international sort of civil servants such as myself, and to ensure that local participants, that those closest to the crimes absorb some of these skills and can take on some of these burdens themselves. So what the CIJA did was basically form relationships with certain civil society and military organizations embroiled within the Syrian crisis, and taught them sort of some key lessons of war crimes investigations. And the principle among those lessons is how important documentation is to war crimes investigations. We always have the option to interview witnesses, but unless they're particularly important witnesses, such as insiders, the thing that war crimes prosecutions will stand and fall on are so-called contemporaneous regime-generated documentation. And by regime, I don't mean the Syrian regime, but the particular regime under investigation. Those documents, they're not going to change. They're often far more useful to demonstrate chains of command between the perpetration of crimes and the leadership, which is usually the focus of war crimes investigation. So we taught a number of actors in Syria, to the extent possible, if fortunes of the war permit and you overrun a facility of your opponent, don't ransack that facility, don't burn their hard drives or their paper, capture that stuff, keep it safe, and where circumstances permit, get it across the border, we'll collect it, we'll take it to Europe, we'll preserve it. The advantage of that is that is preserved in perpetuity, it's kept safe. It can be, we may not be able to do anything justice-wise now, but we preserve the possibility of future efforts in that regard. And we have managed to do that with far greater success in relation to the regime, the Syrian regime, because they are far more old-fashioned in the way they operate. Everything is documented, usually in triplicate and disseminated nationally. So we've had extraordinary successes in overrunning, for example, a very small and obscure detention facility in one outlying province of Syria, and then we realized that what we have in our possession doesn't simply document crimes committed in that location. It shows that these reports, that this activity responded to instructions coming from Damascus and circulated not only to this facility, but at facilities all over Syria, and in turn that reports were going back up to Damascus saying, well, we've done this, and what's going to happen now, and it's really a bit uncoordinated, what do you suggest we do now? And I mean, effectively there is enough from the regime side that would probably satisfy an international criminal tribunal right away of widespread and systematic state-generated criminality. The material we have personally collected in relation to other groups is less dramatic. Certainly it's not difficult to collect evidence showing that Islamic State has committed grave and widespread criminality, but the very nature in which those organizations operate, they don't generally leave a paper trail in the same way, and the structure of the organization is impenetrable, or at least has been largely so to date. Some of these innovations, I think, are encouraging. I think all of us would agree that if we have an opportunity to preserve evidence for the future, then we ought to do so. But there, I think, are a number of clear drawbacks to this process, and I'm just going to list them, and we can discuss them afterwards. The first is that it's uncontrolled. We are dependent on the advice of those in the field as to what we can get, what we can go after. And even what they do manage to obtain, they do so at enormous personal risk. And given that the prospects of justice are pretty remote, it is, I think, a very delicately balanced ethical question as to whether it's fair to even ask people to put themselves in harm's way in that manner. Although many of our Syrian human rights defenders and other actors are really quite inspirational and courageous. They say, look, we have a stake in the outcome of our country, we want to do something. And it's extraordinary, sort of the measures that they have been, and the risks that they've been willing to subject themselves to. Secondly, as I have mentioned that we have no doubt whatsoever that all parties to the Syrian conflict have committed grave crimes. We are not structurally able to investigate the crimes committed by those we rely on to get our documentation. And we've been open about that. We've said that this is actually not abnormal in war crimes prosecutions. You've got to get the material somehow, and then it would be in turn for other groups to investigate that particular group. So independence and total impartiality is not realistic. The other question is, well, at the end of the day, this organization is an NGO. It's got no official status. First, we have to persuade individuals in Syria to take an enormous risk to get this material out, and then they must trust that it's safe and that it's there, and that this material in due course will be used. Other groups might question sort of both the methodology through which that was obtained and the basis on which it might be used in future proceedings. We're also starting to see fragmentation. We're not the only NGOs that have active in this field. Particularly if we get some success, many other NGOs might step up, and then you actually get a challenge of different modalities for collecting evidence in the field through different civil society organizations, or worse, competition between them, and utter confusion, both for parties on the ground and for collection efforts. These bodies are unaccountable to everybody except their donors, and the donors of the CIJA are states. They are a fairly broad base of states, generally Western governments that are supportive of accountability efforts, but there is also a question as to the genuine political impartiality of such initiatives. Then effectiveness and potential impact. In order to be effective, an NGO like this would have to collect evidence in a fashion that can be utilized in future proceedings. The way that is usually done is through procedures such as chain of custody, where basically an item is seized and then it's meticulously documented from that date in which it's seized until it's got to us in Europe, and we can document who has had possession of this material at every phase. And clearly we attempt to do that, but it's in the middle of a very, very intense armed conflict. It's not always possible. And then potential impact. We also interview witnesses as well, although we prefer not to, for reasons that, for various reasons. The first is that it's inevitably re-traumatizing for witnesses to be interviewed, and it's generally best to limit that impact on witnesses. Civil society organizations are limited in their resources, and so statements are often taken through interpreters, and therefore may not meet criminal evidentiary standards in all respects. And thirdly, and more fundamentally, it is undesirable for an eventual criminal process for a victim to have been interviewed by multiple parties before he or she even takes the stand. That outcome tends to benefit largely defense counsel, not prosecutors, because inevitably one will find inconsistencies in those statements, and this can be exploited, as well as, of course, enhancing the risk that the witness may no longer be willing to cooperate, may tire of this process. Another potential impact is in terms of the ongoing safety and security of individuals working for not only ours, but other civil society organizations in Syria. Particularly as the course of the conflict changes, they may legitimately fear that we have exposed ourselves to risk on your behalf. Our lives are inevitably imperiled by our actions. We now rely on you to assist us in that. Now, this scenario is not unusual before international criminal tribunals as well, but the key difference is that international criminal tribunals, being public institutions, have limited capacities to do things like witness relocation, to kind of appeal to states to basically say that, look, this person is in imminent danger. Can you ensure that you have favorable treatment to them as an immigrant, or help the tribunal find some mechanism to protect these individuals. International criminal tribunals haven't always been able to achieve that, but at least structurally they're in a position where on an intergovernmental level they can. A mere NGO just cannot even hope to deliver that. So I think the potential impact, particularly on human rights defenders in the field, is grave, and there is no obvious solution to that. What about any other mechanisms? Well, there are a handful of other accountability mechanisms in relation to the Syrian crisis. There's the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights has a commission of inquiry on Syria, which is another evidence-gathering modality. The focus tends to be on the documentation of, if you like, criminality. It generally isn't well placed to collect the type of evidence that we do, and the so-called linkage evidence to higher level perpetrators. It, however, does a good job of documenting crimes across a lot of Syria. There's a specialized mechanism in relation to alleged uses of chemical weapons. The joint investigative mechanism, as it's called, is a collaboration between the UN Security Council and the Office for the Prohibition of the Use of Chemical Weapons, and that is a highly specialized agency. I think that's doing its best and doing a lot of diligent efforts behind the scenes, but faces a number of constraints as well. But the one I'm going to focus on now is the surprise Christmas gift we received on the 21st of December of 2016, when the United Nations General Assembly basically by a majority adopted a resolution creating a Syrian International Impartial and Independent Mechanism, or the IIIM. This was a direct response by the UN General Assembly to the utter paralysis that has hobbled the Security Council for the last 6 years, and utter impatience with that. The General Assembly, unlike the Security Council, which can be hamstrung by the exercise of veto powers, is a body that can pass resolutions by simple majority. And a majority of the General Assembly agreed to create this mechanism to spearhead accountability efforts in Syria. The IIIM is mandated to collect and analyze evidence of mass atrocities in Syria with the specific aim of facilitating future international judicial proceedings. It is really in its infancy. In fact, it's not even operational yet. One concern that I have, and which is common to a lot of justice initiatives as well, is that the funding modalities for the IIIM is through voluntary state contributions, which is actually a synonym for there won't be any money, or that there'll be money in sort of trickling in very unhelpful small increments. And unfortunately, the IIIM is unable to is not even going to start recruiting until it has a sufficient number of amount of funds already raised. And I think that fundraising is going tolerably well, but the mechanism hasn't even started the recruitment process yet, still less become operational. The other difficulty with that is that the scope of powers of a mechanism created under General Assembly sort of auspices has already been questioned. This is something very dear to my heart. My doctoral studies were on the scope of UN Security Council powers, and I sort of relished the prospect of getting stuck into the scope of General Assembly powers, in situations where the Security Council can't quite get its act together. I think arguments to say that the General Assembly has no capacity in this area are probably exaggerated, but it's definitely also true that the General Assembly lacks the sorts of coercive powers that the Security Council can call on. So I think how that will pan out and how diplomatically that will succeed in sort of getting very disparate member states to work together still remains to be seen. And of course, the IIIM operates in the same complex diplomatic and operational environment as every other initiative that I've described, and it also further needs to harmonize with the mandates of numerous existing entities. So it'll be very interesting in the coming months to watch the IIIM's initial steps. My own personal view is that this institution can have very, very good results if it takes principally a coordinating function between various civil society organizations. It's a little bit of a kind of open secret, many of these organizations don't particularly get on particularly well with each other. So maybe an organization under the auspices of the United Nations that can bang heads together, or sort of pick the best of all available measures out there may actually have a good outcome. But it will clearly have a lot of difficult days ahead of it to ensure that that process is orchestrated in a coherent and effective way. So in conclusion, I think we do have actually about 15 minutes left for questions. I think in summary, the Syrian crisis lays bare not only the absence of condition for effective local governance and post-conflict reconstruction in Syria, but also it reveals profound cleavages between other international actors, and in a very graphic way lays bare just how ineffective our international mechanisms of peace and security are to address what is probably the most profound humanitarian, political, and military crisis of our generation. Unfortunately, the very same forces that handicap that also stymie conventional international criminal justice responses. Thirdly, other forms of responses are encouraging. There's something very inspirational about how civil society has collectively responded to this call and shown a high degree of idea entrepreneurship and creativity in the field. But it can only ever be a partial solution, and the solutions that I've described nor are they free from difficulty. And finally, there's a very recent glimmer of hope, and it really is only a glimmer, in relation to the Syrian IIIM, but a mechanism of this sort is untried, and it already comes burdened with a very, very heavy set of expectations. So I think I'm going to conclude there, and I really welcome your questions and comments. Thank you.
So please feel free to ask questions. I think you've painted a very vivid and difficult question. Mohammed, do you have a question? Yes. You've lived through this crisis, so you can probably ask them.
Many questions actually, and comments as well, but I will brief, a few points. Just, you mentioned first of all that one of the barriers to bring any of the mass murderers to any judgment for the International Criminal Court for accountability, it's been before because of the many parties intervening into the Syrian conflict. Why this conflict started in Syria in 2011, specifically in March, 15th of March actually, this is one correction, for almost 3 years before the emergence of ISIS. We didn't see any action by either the International Criminal Court or any other legal bodies internationally. We didn't see any action as well. Now it's, yes, complicated, but before it wasn't like that for more than 3 years. Then after the emergence of ISIS, it became a little bit complicated. After the intervention of Iran, it became more and more complicated. Russian intervention as well made it worse and worse as well. So do you think doing nothing for more than 6 years, or to bring an action now, is much better than thinking about any action tomorrow or after 1 year or 3-4 years later? So It becomes more complicated. So if we think about an action immediately, it's much better rather than going through 3-4 years again and lose many other lives and get more victims.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think we would all agree that situations like that tend to get worse rather than better. But it's also true that hindsight is 20/20 as well. And I think if one goes back to 2011 or 2012, the prism through which many of those actors would have seen the nascent Syrian crisis would have been the prism of the Libyan intervention, which did not yield any dividend in terms of the post-conflict stability of Libya, and in fact mired and the Iraqi situation as well, where American intervention is now widely and roundly blamed for the destabilization of Iraq in the first place. And bear in mind that, as that scenario also showed, is that intelligence that one gets out of these environments is often of varying quality as well. And so all of that's to say merely that even through the prism of what contemporaneously, or what at the time might have looked like in 2011 and 2012, the dilemma would have been, look, do we risk intervention on behalf of an emergent democratic ideal through this rather amorphous and rather sort of disorganized sort of political opposition to Assad, setting in train basically the fall of this regime with all of the unknowns that entails, or do we not intervene? Because we're criticized if we intervene sometimes as well. But you're right, I think with everything we know now, the situation that we have now is the situation we have now is immeasurably more complicated than the situation we had in 2011 and 2012. I think the broader lesson from this, whether it's Syria or anywhere, that absent, mechanisms on the ground or sort of prospects for a robust civil society that can rebuild these countries from within, it's very hard for any externally imposed solution to achieve the same result. That said, often what external intervention does is not actually that. It's simply to arrest the violence in the first place and to create the prospect of peace. And I think that's probably why Russia's intervention provokes very widely disparate reactions as well. Some feel that simply deepens the conflict, and certainly it raises a lot of Western fears about encroaching Russian influence. On the other hand, some say, well, look, isn't peace at any price better? My concern would be longer term, is that peace, if imposed by any means, the prospects for reconciliation and reconstruction are so poor on the ground due to the impact of this crisis and the utter fragmentation of that society. I don't know what it takes to maintain it, other than a complete sort of reinvigoration of our idea of what it means to be human and to live together and to organize politically. Sorry, that's an extremely long and probably not very helpful response to a simple question, but thank you for that.
Okay. Regarding your three examples, or two examples of Libya and Iraq, that the external intervention didn't bring instability to those two countries. But I have two other examples. I've got the resolution by the UN and the threat from the states and the establishment of the tribunal in regards in Lebanon, in regards to the assassination of al-Hariri, the former prime minister. This brought stability to Lebanon. This imposed or forced the Syrian regime to withdraw from Lebanon as well. I refer to Sudan. The president there, Omar Hassan al-Bashir, who is subject to the prosecution of the International Criminal Court. And there is arrest, and he is requested to be arrested and taken there, despite that Sudan has not signed to the Rome statute. He is not part of this statute at all, Sudan. Despite this, he was summoned to the International Criminal Court as well. And everything has been suspended completely after the separation or the independence of South Sudan. You think about some political purposes of this court as well. I'm not sure if it is neutral enough or not, or biased, or a tool, just a tool used by some international or parties or some other organizations. I'm talking about intervention. We saw in the 1980s in Panama, the US sent their forces and arrested the president of Panama at that time because of some charges of being a drugs dealer, Ortega. This is very famous, regardless of any international rules, international laws, regardless of anything else. So,
absolutely, I think we have a long and checkered history of interventions with very diverse outcomes.
Is meaningless or not?
Yeah, no, I think it's these are unknowns, and they're unknown unknowns, I think, to quote a US leader that, again, with the wisdom of hindsight, doesn't look quite as bad as he did at the time. Thank you for that, those interventions. Are there any other questions to round out this discussion, or comments on what's been said? I think that the gentleman here raises the very good counter-example of Bashir from Sudan, and certainly Sudan is not a party to the Rome Statute either. But the key difference is that the permanent members of the Security Council could unite sufficiently to refer the Sudanese situation to the International Criminal Court. I think while that has had the impact of stigmatizing President Bashir and probably imposes some travel restrictions on him, the outcome has been fairly ambivalent as well, in the sense that unfortunately Bashir is quite free to travel the world, including to some ICC states parties, and notoriously the South African government refused to arrest Bashir when he was in their territory, despite an obligation under the Rome Statute to do so. And secondly, as we all know from the media, a simple referral of a situation to the International Criminal Court hasn't brought a peace dividend to Sudan at all. For the simple reality that merely referring a situation to the International Criminal Court doesn't automatically give the International Criminal Court the capacity to act against even the most grave perpetrators of international crimes. Still less does it enable it to access the territory in these situations. So it's prompted me to even qualify that example, that even if the Security Council could get its act together and refer the Syrian situation in its totality to the International Criminal Court, don't expect a rapid improvement in the justice response. I think the International Criminal Court is located in The Hague and has, in fact, it relies on organizations such as the CIJA for evidence gathering because it's leaner and it's closer to the conflict in Syria. It doesn't itself bring greater resources to bear in terms of collection and investigative capacities.
Probably got time for any more questions. Yeah.
Do you think, with all that in mind, that the ICC is pretty much doomed to disappear in the next 10 years if it's completely...
Do I think the ICC is doomed? I think my career might be if I answer that in the wrong way. No, I don't think it's facing very, very dark days at the moment. But I think the ICC is a little bit like the UN. If you didn't have it, you would have to invent it in some other guise. I think what the ICC represents is the state of our collective thinking about justice and security issues. I think we're collectively speaking, as a sort of planet, we've evolved sufficiently far to acknowledge that there are certain crimes, there is certain conduct that is so reprehensible it should be universally condemned and investigated and prosecuted. Where, however, our collective maturity falters is our double standards. That we can articulate these norms, but we are not very good at imposing them on a uniform basis. At the moment, international criminal justice, and including the International Criminal Court, has achieved very heroic short-term gains in situations that are not of geostrategic sensitivity to any state that matters greatly. The former Yugoslavia, Rwanda, Sierra Leone, Cambodia, generally pretty good outcomes. Any situation that involves the intractable interests of the great powers, the mechanisms are simply stymied because these mechanisms have only as much power as states collectively are willing to grant. And at least one of the permanent members, the United States, has frequently gone on record to say that the United States does not feel the need to subjugate it to any international adjudicatory authority. The Chinese and the Russians believe something quite similar, even if they don't articulate it in the same way. So I think that is the challenge, and I think Syria shows in the most dramatic way the consequences of that. Where those powers interlock, even the most profound risks to our collective security cannot be addressed. And I think that's what the Syrian crisis has done for us, is it showed where certainly our limitations, but it might also show graphically what the consequences are of our failure to address them as well. And maybe that's the tiny glimmer of hope that we can take away. I don't think we can pretend anymore that that allowing this situation to persist is viable or sustainable for any of us. This not only is a crisis with profound humanitarian consequences for all of the victims of Syria, it's had a profound impact on the stability of Europe and arguably even the United States. And I think as we get sort of closer and more intertwined as a sort of global civilization, I think we can't insulate ourselves from this. We have to find a way to behave better on the global plane if we're to survive, I think.
Well, on that note, Susan, I want to... I was thinking of Chairman Mao, who said power is out of the barrel of a gun. I think that's a sad reality, isn't it? The law, kind of when the gun's coming at you, doesn't do a lot to stop it, really, which is very sad.
Well, I think, Well, I think Syria, there's no shortage of guns, but it hasn't achieved a drop.
No, eventually there will be very few people left, which is very sad. But I think you've given a very realistic and a very insightful into the complexities, which are really complex. And as you say, if it doesn't grow from within, it's very hard to impose from the outside. I mean, it's just very difficult. But I think the last point you made is one we all have to think about in terms of the impact on all of us. I mean, it certainly has having impact across the world, because people are seeing people exiting Syria as a problem for the rest of the world, which is very sad in itself too.
Absolutely.
So thank you very much, Susan, for coming and sharing your frontline, because you're a frontline worker, and your incredible insight and understanding of what happened on the internet. So please join me in thanking Susan very much.